Okay, so our next speaker, she's the lead designers of the design systems team at Salesforce UX. And there she helps create systems for enterprise software. And she didn't run away when she heard enterprise software. She stayed. She actually stayed quite a long time. I run away when I hear that word, but something is going on here, I guess. I mean, they do something at Salesforce, I think, that they didn't do at other enterprise software companies. Because the design systems they create, they're lauded everywhere. Everybody loves them, right? We read about them, everybody just wants to learn about them. So the fantastic thing is that she's here to share her knowledge. And the thing that I thought, when you work at such a huge company in an enterprise environment, there has to be some sort of very smart thinking, some clever problem solving, and she proved that 2 days ago. In the hotel of the speakers, the air conditioning broke down. And there were several ways to solve this. So you could go down and get a van. But Jina wrote in our super secret Slack channel, everything stays in that channel, except for this quote. I just took everything out of the mini fridge and put them in my pajamas. So, please give a very warm applause for Jina Bolton.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be in Switzerland for the first time. As mentioned, my name is Jina, already mentioned, lead designer on the design systems team at Salesforce. With being a publicly traded big company, I do have to give a disclaimer. Let me know when you're done reading that. Just kidding. No, so basically, don't buy any stock based on anything I say. That would be kind of silly. So yeah, design systems, they kind of rule everything around me. I've been a big fan of them for many years, and now I get to do this as my job. It's my dream job. There's design systems teams on all sorts of companies, like the last talk. Etsy, they have a design systems team. I think they're rad, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the one that we work on. So yeah, the style guides are often brought up in the context of design systems. The first style guide that I did was 12 years ago when I was an intern at a design agency called Odin. And Odin's way of delivering style guides were in a PDF. So these were done in InDesign. It wasn't very fun. It's a lot of reflowing documents as you make changes. But it did get me kind of already starting to think about this as an intern. Fast forward to a few years later, I was at Apple, and I was working on the online store team. And when you're trying to build lots of components for e-commerce sites, style guides are definitely necessary. The one I did back then was on WordPress. I thought it was more clever to take them online. Still wasn't quite really where they could be, like they are today. But it was a way that people could collaborate and work on the style guide without having to reflow an InDesign document. But yeah, got super into them, really liked them, to the point that I wrote my first article about them on Alistapart called Writing an Interface Style Guide. So the gist of this article was writing brand and design standards, front-end standards, and the important part of this was keeping your style guide current and useful. So that's kind of going to be more about what I talk about going forward. So what is a design system? I was listening to a podcast with Jared Spool, and he was interviewing Nathan Curtis. And if you haven't heard of Nathan Curtis, definitely check out his writings. He writes a ton about design systems. It's basically what he does. And in this interview, Jared Spool asked Nathan, we have style guides, now it's design systems. Is this just a change in the marketing, or are these things actually different from one another? So Nathan has come up with this definition that gets quoted a lot in design system talks, and it's one that I really like. And it says that style guides are an artifact of design process, whereas a design system is a living, funded product with a roadmap, a backlog, serving an ecosystem. So now I'm at Salesforce. I love my job. Yes, it's enterprise. I actually like the enterprise challenge that it brings me. And yeah, so why would a company like Salesforce need a design system? Well, enterprise design can be really, really tricky, especially at the scale of what we're at. We have about like 17 years of UI legacy that we're dealing with. At the last number I heard, I think we're at about 20K plus employees. That's kind of a lot of people. And we're acquiring companies all the time. We just acquired, I think, 3 or 4 in the last month. We have a lot of products. And this is just some of them. This isn't the full list. A lot of things to think about. So to design at Salesforce is to consider the whole ecosystem. So about 3 years ago, we launched Salesforce One, which was our mobile application. And it basically was our first foray into like totally revamping our UI. And we learned a lot about this process. Designer-developer communication is really important, and we would hear a lot of the same questions like, where can I find the icons? What color is the border? Where can I find the icons? And so, definitely need to improve that. I love this quote by Diana Mounter, who writes and talks about empowering designers to code. And she said that true collaboration isn't throwing designs over the wall. It's designers, engineers, and the rest of the team sharing the responsibility to build a quality product. So one of the things that we had tried out, and a lot of design agencies do this, and a lot of startups have done this, is what's known as red lines. If you're not familiar with what red lines are, it's basically where you spec out your designs to great detail, all the spacing, sizing, fonts, and so on. But as you can imagine, at the scale of what I just talked about, it's not fun. I would not recommend redlining all of that. Red lines, I feel like red lines are promoting designing pages, thinking about things on pages, and that's just not really the way you want to think about UI, not just for enterprise, but really for any application that you're working on. As part of the Salesforce One process of designing them, we created the style guide. It's no longer online because we have the new stuff out now. But this was pretty popular back in the day. In fact, when I saw this style guide, I switched over to this team because I really wanted to work on it. And we demoed this at Dreamforce. Dreamforce is our Salesforce conference that takes over San Francisco for about a week. And we talked to a lot of developers and a lot of customers and people that build applications to belong in the Salesforce ecosystem, internal and external people. And we received a lot of questions like, well, how do I get my app to look like this? And can I use your CSS in my app? So we realized that the style guide that we had at the time didn't really quite solve the problem, and it didn't really give people an official way to use it. So about last year, around this time, we announced Lightning Experience, which was our new revamped UI brought over to the desktop app, or the desktop web UI. And as part of that process, we built a design system called Lightning Design System. That's the product that I work on, and really excited about where it's headed. And if you're interested in checking out the source code, it is open source on GitHub. So you can go to Salesforce-UX on GitHub and see all our repositories there. So going forward in this talk, I'll probably use the acronym SLDS for Salesforce Lightning Design System. Some people try to use LDS, but we're not Mormons, so we opt for SLDS instead. So designing systems. This is what it's all about. This is what we want. But how do we design one of these? I'll share. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is the way, and I'm probably sure many of you are building things similar, and you're probably doing it in very different ways, and that is totally okay. But perhaps there's someone out there brand new to this, or trying to solve certain things, and maybe what I can share will help. So we'll see. So the key thing, I think, for even just beginning is to have a clear vision to align efforts. My mentor at Salesforce is Craig Villamore. He's the chief design architect, and he wrote in one of his blog posts that the more decisions you put off and the longer that you delay them, the more expensive they become. And so it's really important to make design decisions well and to make them quickly. It's super important to bring designers, engineers, product managers, like all the different people that are involved together around a single goal. And so for us, we felt it was very important to make sure that we drive our design decisions around design principles that we all agree on and formalize. So I'll share what our 4 design principles are. First one is clarity. We want to eliminate ambiguity, enable people to see, understand, and act with confidence. By the way, the illustrations on these 4 slides were from our intern at the time, and we hired him because he's awesome. The second design principle is efficiency. Streamline and optimize workflows, intelligently anticipate needs to help people work better, smarter, and faster. Forgot to mention these are San Francisco buildings and landscapes. The third one is consistency. Create familiarity, strengthen intuition by applying the same solution to the same problem. And then fourth is beauty. Demonstrate respect for people's time and attention through elegant and thoughtful craftsmanship. One of the things that's really important to us, anytime we list anything out, it's always in a priority order. So whether it's a list of tasks or a list of ideas or a list of anything, they're in priority order. So this order that I gave these principles to you are very important to us. And it's sort of how we stack rank our decision making. So clarity is number 1. It's core to the experience, and users need clarity to complete their tasks and to reach their goals. If we could ensure that users successfully reach their goals over and over and over, then we earn their trust, their loyalty, and their gratitude. And then second is efficiency. This came up repeatedly when we were talking to our customers, and we almost put it at the top, but we considered, like you can double down on efficiency, but that could have some drawbacks. If you design a bunch of shortcuts for expert users, you might alienate brand new users that aren't familiar with the UI. And if we took efficiency to the extreme, new users would probably be overwhelmed. And you want to avoid users making mistakes because mistakes are very costly. So efficiency is very important to us, but clarity outweighs that. And then third is consistency. In a design systems talk, you might be confused why consistency is number 3. Usually consistency is considered the number 1 thing. And it is important. It's why it's one of our design principles. It also helps build intuition over time and establish patterns. But good systems need to be able to evolve and allow for opportunities to innovate. And what if something's consistently not great? So it's important, but obviously clarity and efficiency are much more important to us than that. And then beauty. Beauty is important, especially for designers, but it's not the defining characteristic of the product. It's about getting things done. So yeah, we would love to just make beautiful UIs, but if they're tedious, then we're not really solving anyone's problems. So yeah, this is the order that we think through things. So if something we could argue is like, hey, it'll be more consistent, but doing something different is actually going to provide better clarity, then that solution would actually win. Design principles are so much more important for design systems than design standards. And yes, design systems are all about creating design standards, but the principles are king in this situation. It's also really important to evangelize and align teams, people, products. get people excited about it. So our design principles, we had that beautiful artwork I showed earlier from our intern. We created posters and we put them all over the walls in the UX areas to kind of remind people and give some people like something to think about when they're having their design discussions. And as I mentioned before from the quote from Nathan, a design system is a product. So as you design a product, you have to do your research. So we interviewed designers, engineers, product managers, writers, sales and marketing, even execs, partners. And these are like face-to-face interviews. And then asking questions, pain points, like how can we make your design process better? How can we make your development process better, and so on. And that gave us a lot to work from and know like where to prioritize and stack rank what we were going to do. It's also important to consider, but also embrace your constraints. So we have a lot of constraints, especially in an enterprise organization like ours. So some of those things that we have to consider, one of them is accessibility. Accessibility is incredibly important to us. In fact, it's the law for us because we have a lot of government customers. So everything that we make has to be accessible. And this is everything from like standards compliant markup to even color contrast. On the right, there's an example of like foreground colors, which would be like text, on background colors. We have to make sure everything's high contrast. There's this really great talk Cordelia McGee-Tubb from Dropbox gave at Clarity earlier this year. And she was talking about accessibility using a blueberry muffin as a metaphor. And she said, if you make the muffin and then realize, oh, it's supposed to be a blueberry muffin, and you cram the blueberries in later, it's going to be a kind of a crappy muffin. But if you bake them in from the beginning, then it's a great blueberry muffin. And so when it comes to accessibility, don't just cram it in later, like do it from the beginning. Yeah, I really loved that metaphor a lot. Oh, my battery is about to, whoopsies. I'll let you guys do that and I'll keep going. So one of our other constraints is localization. So things like cultural significance, color is really important, not using flags to represent languages, things like text expansion, even like capitalization. There's a lot to consider. And color can really change meaning. If you look at a stocks app, for example, like in the US, red is usually a negative color, which means that that stock is not doing well. However, if you are looking at a stocks app in China, red is actually a positive color. It means fortune. So they use red for up. Yeah. So color is very important to consider. And of course, you have other considerations that are like constraints that you embrace and work with. For us, we have customers that want to brand and theme their experience. We have admins that configure and move things around. Having like certain partners get exclusive access to things so they can get a head start. And you have things like forward-looking features, like how do you expose that to them? Open source, like once you make things public, like how do you build and create things in a way that represents like good quality? And so yeah, lots of things to consider. And then there's the team. I really loved the last talk because it focused on teams. I love thinking about team structures. Nathan, again, another quote from him, but he wrote this fantastic article called Team Models for Scaling a Design System. And in his post, he goes through 3 different models that he's observed. The first one being the solitary model, which is basically you have a team that basically makes a design system or CSS framework or whatever, and then they distribute it, but it's pretty much like you can use it, but we basically consider what goes into it, we prioritize what we need, and it's up to you. The second model is more of what a lot of companies are doing right now, is having a centralized design systems team. And this is the team that produces and supports a system that is used by other people, and that's part of their job. And then the third model is what's known as federated. And that's basically where you have designers from multiple product teams that decide on the system together. At the end of the post, he asks, would love to hear like how your company does it. So I wrote my little follow-up post to it called the Salesforce team model for scaling a design system. And it's not really introducing a new model. It's really more of a blending of the latter two models that he mentions. And so I called it a cyclical team model. And so we have federated contributors from many of our products, but we also have a centralized team. And it's a very cyclical pairing process. And so our design system is informing our product designers' designs, but then since those designers are out in the trenches doing their own research, coming to their own conclusions, they are in turn contributing back into the design system. So their product design is informing our design system. The pairing, I think, is really important. I think even the best systems still need that like human guidance to succeed and survive. And a lot of design systems go into like automation, and that's like awesome, but you need that like human interaction to really make it thrive. So, centralized design systems team, which is what I'm on, we sort of act as like librarians or distributors and facilitators, and we make sure that everything's crafted and maintained, and that we keep the quality up. And then the design systems contributors from federated teams, they're the ones that are ensuring that we keep our design system accurate, honest, and actually useful, because it's, serving them. All right, so we started out with a UI inventory. This can be a lot of fun if you have the right people involved that just like have the energy to sketch and like print out sheets of paper of the UI and cut them up into pieces and try to group them together. Like it could be a really fun thing to do, but it will also reveal a lot of things. So as you're auditing your UI, you want to categorize the different types of components that you have along with the variants that are involved. So we had a lot of days of just sketching different UI screens and elements, and then like going through our designs and looking at all the ways we show progress indicators or loading statuses or drop downs, tabs, and so on, and grouping these things together, and then looking for where like larger components are consuming smaller components. Buttons are a really obvious example because they're in almost everything. So as you do this, you standardize and you consolidate all these pieces, and it's really important to take lots and lots of notes. And these notes can be like the different layouts that are involved, responsive behaviors, visual differentiation, states, keyboard navigation, accessibility requirements, like all the different things that you need to know about that component. And even things like who are the people involved, who are the design leads, who are the engineering leads, any open-ended questions that you have to solve. Miriam Suzanne said, if you don't document something, it doesn't exist. So we definitely have found that too. It's like you have to document, take notes, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. I think when people do UI inventories, people get kind of caught up on terminology. Like, is this an element? Is this a component? Is this a region? Is this an atom? Is this a molecule? It's really like, it's just all components. Like, just get through with that. Small components and big components, it's just all components. And the other thing that you're going to find, and it's totally okay in some situations, is what we like to call special snowflakes. And these are the things that just need to be different, and it's just how it is. And that's okay. And if it's something that would be shareable, you can put it in the design system, but in some cases, you don't really need to put it in a design system. Like the homepage, I think Nathan Curtis used this example in one of his talks. The homepage is going to be different all the time. You're going to be changing out content all the time. So that's not really something you need to put in the design system. What you can put are design guidelines. Obviously, there's the components that we talked about, but design guidelines are what help align and get all the designers on the same page. So things around like visual design, interaction patterns, even UI copy. And as you're documenting these patterns, it's important to kind of talk about like when and why you use it. Like when do you use a toast versus a pop-up notification versus a notification in the tray. Like there's usually going to be like a rule as to when you're using what, and that's what you want to document. Color is something you see in pretty much every style guide out there. This is an example of one of the color palettes that we had. But one thing that's really important to do alongside your pretty little swatches is to talk about how you use this color. So like how do you use color for visual messaging? How to use it to differentiate things like different objects, and how you use it to convey visual hierarchy. And by having all this stuff documented, and of course this is going to be an iterative thing over time, but it really helps designers, especially brand new designers joining the team, to know what the established ways of designing at this company is. Katie Basie is one of our newer product designers, and she wrote a blog post about how the design system helped her ramp up as a brand new designer on the team. And she's really into interaction design and creating flows, and so for her, this was awesome. She said, freed from some of the daily tedium that can come with being a designer, I can shift the bulk of my time and energy to looking at the bigger picture. So instead of thinking about what color things are, how many pixels something is, she's thinking about interaction flows, and that's like where she prefers to spend her time. A great design system empowers your designers and your developers. It empowers your designers to design and iterate more efficiently in the browser. And if not, you can provide other tools for people that don't work in the browser, but it's awesome if you can to work a lot more efficiently. And then like developers, we provide scalable, accessible code at the beginning of the development lifecycle now, where before it was something that kind of was like a bug filed at the end and we would try to fix things. Now it's like part of our design system at the very beginning. So by the time it gets into the product, it's already been vetted and tested for that. In today's world of product design, we have a lot of platforms and devices, and now we've even got like UIs for like refrigerators and all sorts of things now. So a lot of things to consider and to try to scale across. So some of the questions that we would get were like, well, how do you maintain consistency across such a massive organization and like all these platforms and devices and so on? And as we're updating our visual design, how do we apply these visual design changes faster? And because we have a developer ecosystem, we have to keep our design system agnostic. So how do we do that? Some of our developers are using Lightning, which is our own platform, but some designers and developers are working in all sorts of things, like native technology, React, Angular, even PHP. Like there's all sorts of stacks that people are using, and we have to try to provide tools that work for all these people. So it's important for us to minimize dependencies so it can be leveraged in more places. For us to scale our design, we have our single source of truth, which is what is known as design tokens. We open sourced a tool called Theo, which help you generate tokens. And if you're interested, please check it out and let us know any feedback, because we're pretty excited about the potential of what it can do. So tokens are, if you're thinking of things in terms of like atoms, they're the sub-atoms. They're the basic, smallest elements of our design system. We introduced them about 2 years ago, and now they're starting to get adopted. I think saw like Target starting to use them. I think 8Shapes, which is Nathan Curtis's agency, like they're using them now. And they're really great. They're a great way to apply your design system across multiple platforms. And they help us scale our design across multiple devices as well. So what are they? They're basically named entities that store design values. So if you're familiar with CSS preprocessors, think of it like a SAS variable. And this is where we get our abstraction. So the way it looks is we have either JSON or YAML. You can choose your own adventure there. At the top of the file, we can give it global attributes, which are things like this is a text color or this is a type of color. And that's how you can use that to generate your documentation in your style guide. And then the required elements of the token in that file are basically the name and the value. We also provide a comment because we like to provide clarity. If the name isn't descriptive enough, we can give more info on how the token is used. But we do try to name our things very clearly so that you already know where it's used. So name, value, comment, and other optional elements. You might have, I mentioned the global things you can do. You can actually override tokens in context, which sometimes is necessary to say to go into a different category or that it's deprecated or whatever. And we also flag our tokens with allowed CSS properties. And we do that so that when tests run, they make sure nobody's using a token in the wrong place. And then because our token names are created very semantically, we also have aliases, which are more of the descriptive, like for colors, I think are a good example. The colors, so we know like what that hex value is actually, it's a blue or it's a green or whatever. So they're like sub-tokens in a way. So our semantic tokens reference aliases. And the way we use this is, so our designers, when they're doing their specs, they don't reference hard-coded values anymore. They don't say 16 pixels. Instead, they'll say spacing medium. And this ensures that their design stays accurate, even if we have to make changes. And so what Theo does is your JSON or your YAML file will convert into Lightning syntax, which is, again, our platform. It also converts to SAS variables, less variables, stylus. For iOS, it converts to JSON. For Android, it converts to XML. It generates the style guide, and it even generates the color swatches for designers to use. And we have this plugged into our continuous integration environment. And to show kind of what that looks like, in the top left, we have our Theo file that I mentioned. On the top right is a file generated from Theo that we use in our design system. So we use SAS variables. And then on the bottom is the Lightning token, which is what our developers on the Lightning platform use. And it also takes into consideration things like, well, if it's CSS, you might be using hex, but if you're using iOS, you might be using a different format, especially like Android uses 8-digit hex instead of RGBA, so it'll make that conversion. And things like units of measurement, so you might be using certain ones for CSS and different ones for iOS or Android. So this is an example of our page that's generated from these. So you can see our full library of tokens, and we have a ton of them because we have a huge app. And then our designers get color swatches that are generated from these as well. Yeah, they're pretty cool. But yeah, so naming conventions around tokens. As we all know, naming is hard. Semantics matter, and I also thought it was important to use a generic to specific pattern because we can write automation tests around this following those patterns. And it's also important when you're creating these tokens, you want to prevent errors. So what we found some people would do is they would not see a token with the right name, but the value was what they wanted, so they would use it. And so we always encourage people, like, if there's not a token for your use, submit the token request, or like we can work with you to create that token, because it's more important to have it semantically correct to where it's used, because it might be red today just like the other thing that's red, but maybe tomorrow you want that thing to be blue, but you want to keep the other thing red, so it's important to keep it semantic. So our token naming, this is like a worst case scenario name. None of our token names are actually this long, but this is the progression we use. So we give it a category prefix, and that's what our, it provides clarity when you use the token, but it also, we can use this naming structure for our testing. And then whatever the object or the component is that it's applied to. And then the variant or like alternate, so it might be like a secondary version of something. And then state changes, like hover, active, stuff like that. And then sometimes you might have a theme switching thing, like it's an inverse version of it because it's on dark instead of light. So this is the order of progression when we name our tokens. And I already covered aliases, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over that. Yeah, so the raw format of our token, this is our worst case scenario, long name token, which again, we've never really had a token that long, I think. But the raw format, we do it like this, like all caps and underscore. But it will convert to the right format for, in SAS, we prefer lowercase and hyphens with a $sign. Less, of course, uses an @sign. Lightning is camel case. So yeah, it makes that conversion too. And then yeah, so examples of the prefixes at the beginning are things like font weight, font size, just like CSS properties. It helps provide clarity on where that token is used and how you use it. And then some of the variant suffixes are things like strong, weak, secondary, tertiary, and so on. Yeah, obvious state suffixes, and then theme context. So what does this give us? This gives us no more hard-coded values. This is really important for us because it prevents errors and it's framework agnostic. I could give a whole talk on design tokens alone, but let's move on. But it's really something I think is essential if you're having to consider all these different things that we're having to consider. And the other thing you get out of it is it does provide an avenue for things like theme switching for customers that want it, or if you have to do like a sort of like a switching of, so regular UIs are going to be spaced out and airy, but certain console UIs need to be tighter and more compact to have more information on the screen. You can do a lot of cool things with tokens. So our design system distribution, which is essentially our CSS framework, you've heard me talk about tokens, you've heard me talk about HTML, CSS a little bit, icons. We give the font, swatches, guidelines, but you probably noticed there's something I didn't talk about, and that's JavaScript. As I mentioned before, it is really important for us to remain agnostic, and as agnostic as possible, and we have to lower the bar for adoption. So we chose to not distribute a JavaScript implementation, and it's up to the developer. However, like I said, most of our developers are using Lightning, so if they're using Lightning, they're going to get that all baked in anyway. But if they're not, then they can use React or Angular, jQuery, and so on, whatever they want. And there's a lot of third-party developers that have been producing their own JavaScript versions of our design system, which is really cool. And yeah, so these are some of the more popular things people are using our design system in tandem with. So we have to rely, because we can't use JavaScript to show states, we rely on our documentation, and this is a constraint that we work with. So our information architecture currently demonstrates what the outcome would be in the docs rather than giving you the JavaScript. So we explain like where you need to add a class or remove a class or add an ARIA attribute. tab indexes, like all that stuff that you have to switch back and forth, we have to explain in our docs. So on the right of the components, we have the different states. So you can kind of click through and see the state. The component will switch out and show what that state is supposed to look like, and we show the code that changes. So here you can see, like, this is like the focused version, and then the code will change in the documentation. And then we have our component documentation underneath to go into any further information. Like sometimes certain things have a lot of requirements and considerations, so we try to be very clear on what you need to do to use this component. And any accessibility and JavaScript needs that you might have. So for what we do, so we are working on this design system. We have it open source, but what you see in what's open source is not what we're always working on right now. We actually work on like 3 supported versions at one time. So there is the current what's public, what's open source. We're supporting that one. We also have what is about to go out. And then we're already also working on the release before that. So we're working on like 3 releases at one time. So yeah, as I mentioned, the current production release, the previous production, and there's the previous one because we don't want to leave anyone out. And then what's coming out in the future. So something that is definitely a thing to consider well is deprecation. Especially when you're open sourcing, this is a really important thing to think through and consider. So what does that mean for us? So we flag things in our documentation, obviously, if it's deprecated, and we explain what you should be using instead. And initially, when we started out, we would just leave a little comment to do, and but it had a major drawback in that let's be real. When you use to do comments in your CSS, do you ever really just right away go and do it? No, nobody really does that. So we created a tool called Sass Deprecate, and because we're using Sass, we were like, well, why not deprecate with Sass? So the way it works, and you define what your app version is. So let's say you're in 1.0. If you're familiar with Semver, it follows the same Semver pattern. And then you have the variable for your version, which is the version which you want the code to deprecate. And then you have like the message that you want the person developing to see, and that all gets worked into a mixin. And so the way that looks is, let's say you're in 1.0, somewhere in your framework, you have the variable established app version, and then you have button icon, and then you've decided, let's deprecate this. You're now in app version 2.0. You want this to deprecate in 3.0, so you wrap it in the mixin for 3.0 and put a message that says use this thing instead. And once we hit version 3.0, that will no longer compile, which is a nice way to have a smaller compiled CSS at the end. And then it also will, and for us, when we're working in our terminal, we get a little notice saying, hey, you have deprecated code, and then you can go clean it out. And this has a lot of advantages. Like if you are just working with normal CSS and you deprecate things, but you don't have a path to remove those things, really your CSS is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But by having a tool or methodology like this, you ensure that your CSS doesn't get bloated over time through deprecation. So that's also open source. Feel free to check that out. And it's built by one of our really awesome sister teams called Design Systems Ops. Kalig is one of the members of that team, and he wrote a blog post about what Design Systems Ops is. I recommend checking it out because it's really cool, and I think it helps like keep design systems automated and maintainable. But yeah, that's important. Automation and maintaining helps avoid zombie style guides. I see so many style guides get put up online and they slowly die and rot. We don't want zombie style guides. It's really important that it's living. It's got to be living. And as I mentioned, quoting Nathan about how a design system is a product, good products have good support. So we do advisory boards, office hours, we have Slack channel. Internally, we also have our chatter group. We do updates in our town halls. We have sprint reviews, bug bashes, feedback surveys, like all that stuff. And of course, documenting and documenting and documenting. Like, it's part of the job. Like, it's a product. You have to support the product, and that's what keeps it usable by the entire organization. And the other thing I think is important is to remember that, as Claudina mentioned, patterns are not dogma. They can change and adapt. I think a lot of people get really stuck in like the whole standards thing, like we can't change it. It's like this, but the whole purpose of building a design system is to create great products, and so you have to allow room for them to change and adapt over time. And that means don't be a dictator. Don't be like, you must do it this way because design systems team says so. Like, you have to allow room for evolution and iteration. So as I mentioned, everything is open source on GitHub. Salesforce-UX is our username. There's also so many articles, blog posts, podcasts about style guides and design systems. So I recommend checking out styleguides.io. Like, there's so much on there. I also created a design systems Slack, which I invite you all to join. If you go to designsystems.herokuapp.com, it auto-invites you. It's got like almost 1,000 people in there right now of people nerding out about this kind of stuff, which is so fun and so cool. And I also run a design systems conference called Clarity, and I'm almost ready to release details on year 2, which will be in the end of March next year. So hopefully you can come over to San Francisco and check it out. And these slides are available on my speaker deck. Jina is my username, and just use designing a design system. And thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. Really, really, really good stuff. I needed this 7 years ago when I was still working. Where was this stuff back then?
Well, I think people have been doing this kind of stuff for a while, but it's all the rage right now. Everybody's talking about it, so it's really exciting.
7 years ago, we had to invent this stuff, and it was really a lot of failure back then. I was thinking, so I'm more from the agency background, and we have clients, and often they have multiple agencies doing stuff for them. Any tips on how to work in that kind of environment? Any ideas?
Well, yeah, so I've mostly been in-house. It's been a long time since I've worked at an agency, but I did talk to an agency recently because I had some similar questions. Obviously, you want to have a different experience for each of your clients. You don't want to build the same design system, but there's going to be patterns and things that emerge from that, and so those are the things that you want to hold on to. And by doing, like, maybe it's design tokens, maybe it's something else, but by giving them a way to configure and change things, it might actually be a way to ship design like very quickly for your clients. Just swap out some colors and whatnot. But since I've been in the house so long, like, I'm not sure I'm the best expert for that.
Yeah, I guess so.
But there are some agency people in that design system Slack.
Okay. Other thing I was wondering is there, okay, so when we go back to the beginning of this conference, we had this talk about everything looks the same and that we need more art direction. And could you imagine some sort of a system where there's room for art direction for some areas of an app or something like that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I mentioned before, not everything needs to be in the design system. Like home pages are going to be, different. Like you might have all sorts of areas where you can do art-directed editorial type stuff. And then one of the things that we've built this thing for an app, but we have people now that want to use it for help documentation and stuff like that. So now we're looking at the concept of subsystems, and one of those is being an editorial style version of our design system. I don't see why they can't play well together.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay, thanks. Any questions from the audience? I think we have time for one or two. No questions.
There's someone over here.
Oh, there's a question over there.
Thanks. It's a great talk. You spoke about snowflakes. Isn't every snowflake special? I mean, in the sense of how do you handle situation where people think, well, this is different? And
Yeah, so we do challenge special snowflakes whenever we feel like they don't need to exist. A lot of times it's because the designer or the product manager didn't know that there was something already in existence. But because we want to keep evolving and iterating, sometimes what the designer or product person is offering is actually an improvement or something better, so we can take that and bring it back into the system. But every once in a while there is that thing that comes through, and you just have to kind of understand when that happens, like that it's research driven and that this needs to be different because it performs better or users understand it better, in which case that's fine. Yeah, but usually when we say special snowflakes, we're being a little snarky. It's like, oh, another special snowflake. Anyone else?
More questions? Question over here. I'll give you my mic.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You mentioned that you are ready for the big redesign because you have everything in variables and tokens, and you can just pull the trigger and everything looks different. Do you really think that this will happen and it will work so that you can just kind of recolor everything and respace? Or in reality, maybe the whole idea of an interface is different in 5 years and you still have to redo everything?
Oh, obviously, that's a given, I think. Like, you're always going to be iterating and refactoring and adding and deprecating. It's part of the process. We know it'll help us do things faster, like changing type, changing spacing, changing colors. Like, that's all like really quick for us now. But sometimes you might have a completely different layout, and that's fine. You just do it. Yeah. So yeah, I hope when I was talking about that, I didn't mean to imply that that's all we do. We just, it just enables us to do it faster. Does that make sense? Cool. Anyone else?
Thanks a lot for this. I'll use this on my next style guide. You talked about special snowflake components. What about special snowflake parts of the company, like silos who think we're special, we want our own style guide, we are different? How did you deal with that, especially when rolling it out for the first time?
Yeah, so that's something we're working through right now. We do have companies that will have their own brand. Like Heroku is an example of a company with a very strong brand that's unique to them. And so we're working through, like, how do we do subsystems or just deliver parts of the system and still allow these companies to do their own thing. So, yeah.
If there's one more question, we can do one more. No? Okay.
All right, thanks
Thank you
everyone.
very much.